Crossing the Rosetta branch of the Nile, we find Tanta, a perfectly oriental city. The best time at which to visit this city is during the summer fair. Great crowds of dervishes, with their green and party-colored flags, swarm in irregular masses through the country. Men, women, and children, mounted on camels, donkeys, and horses, throng the roads, while thousands on foot are seen for days and nights, wending their way to the seat of pleasure and religion. Luckily for Egypt, the American War came on. Egyptian cotton planting increased, and as a consequence, the government grew rich. The remarkable growth of cotton and sugar has greatly increased the value of the land and the attractiveness of the region. Amid the throngs are also those who bring daintier wares in human form, beautiful virgins, sent forth by their Circassian or Georgian mothers to find an asylum in the land of the Nile. These maidens have been carefully nurtured to be made marketable, and are happy if they succeed in becoming the property of some rich bey or pacha. It is the custom to fix a price upon these young women, the sum varying with the beauty of the merchandise. The girl whose marriage in this market is successful induces her young kinswomen to follow her from their bleak homes in the Caucasus to the sunnier climate of Egypt. I may fitly take occasion to say something of slavery itself as it exists in Egypt. It will continue as long as the harem system remains, where men consider their wives as slaves. The harem is a sanctuary into which no one but the lord and master thereof can enter. People of all nationalities have been enslaved. The mothers of many of the viceroys of Egypt were slaves, and nearly every wife of the old pachas was purchased for a small sum. A recent minister of war, Qasim Pacha, was born a Greek Christian in Cyprus. He was taken prisoner in his youth and sold into slavery. Slavery is, however, much more humane there as a general thing than it is in Cuba, where licensed cruelty is permitted at the very doors of the freest government on the earth. The Negro in Egypt is used entirely for domestic purposes. He acts as a doorkeeper, looks after the horses, and in his picturesque dress, runs before the carriage of his master. He cleans, fills, and lights his master's pipe and brings him his coffee, drinking the first cup, and generally has little to do. He rarely or never is a laborer or works in the fields. The hard-working cultivator of the soil is the native Egyptian, the brown and yellow man, the fellah. Talk of slavery in any other country compared with that of the fellah. The former slaves of America lived in palaces and dressed in fine linen in comparison. Docile and amiable, the fellah is resigned to his lot and carries the heavy yoke uncomplainingly. He is willing to receive any number of lashes and will turn the other cheek for more. He delights to kiss the hand that strikes him, and being a grown-up child, he weeps when the stroke pains him. That is all.
These are the words of William Wing Loring, a Confederate soldier who was hired by the Egyptians to lead their armies. Now, Egypt at that time was modernizing and was looking to expand, in particular into Ethiopia. Loring was in fact recommended by another American, William Tecumseh Sherman, who was also out in Egypt, but he fought for the Union in the Civil War. Quite a few Americans made their way over to Egypt after the Civil War, in particular Southerners. This is because, as Loring pointed out, Egypt was becoming a major cotton producer. During the war, as the Confederacy was blockaded, the British in particular were looking for new markets and invested heavily in the Egyptian market, so many Southerners were able to find employment in Egypt. Loring, however, was just tasked with leading the army south, and initially he was in command of the invasion force, or at least he was promised command. This, however, was taken away from him and Ratib Pasha was put in control. He was a man with limited military experience, and also a man Loring would complain about a lot. So we join him again as he is in Massawa in modern-day Eritrea, as the armies are preparing to move inland and invade Ethiopia in 1874.
It was found that there were few camels at Massawa, our alliance for transportation. Weeks passed, and yet they did not come. In the meantime, Kirkham, an Englishman who had been for several years in the service of King John in Abyssinia, came to Massawa. He was sent under the pretense of bringing back to us a peace offering, an officer and 105 prisoners captured in the Arendrup affair. Of these unfortunate people, 27 were horribly mutilated. This well-timed embassy had the desired effect. Instead of lashing the Egyptians into a frenzy of righteous indignation and the desire to revenge their mutilated comrades, it filled them with dismay. On the morning of the departure, as it was expected, there was a great deal of confusion. Vast crates of crockery, boxes of wine, and delicacies of all kinds, enormous tables and pots and kettles with a huge iron stove were piled up on the backs of camels and mules. As the train wound its way around the narrow causeway, one could see mules kicking off their loads and camels running off, scattering the valuable property of the prince and lessening, amid the crash of wine bottles and crockery, the chances of Ratib for a good dinner. Our ride during the night was very dark and dismal, and the rain made it especially unpleasant. The only breaks in the monotony of this ride were caused by the cries of the jackal and the scream of the hyena. There was at Yanguz a horse upon which an Arab had once been seated, when a lion sprang upon him. I saw where the beast had struck his huge claws and dragged the flesh from the hindquarters of the animal. Throughout this day, the splendid marching quality of the Egyptian was observable. Stepping closely to the ground, he moves easily along without fatigue. He is tall and finely proportioned, never touching bacon and living upon little. Free from the effects of liquor, his wounds heal rapidly, and he bears, while calling upon Allah, the most excruciating agony from wounds, with a fortitude approaching almost to apathy. And when death approaches, he meets it without a murmur. Next morning, having climbed the pass, we got a slight glimpse of the small sombre valley of Gura, which is about 8 miles long and 2 broad. The forces were suddenly halted by Ratib Pacha, and to our surprise, turned off to the left. Passing through the villages of Gura and over the high hill, we descended into a very small, contracted valley without trees, in a splendid place for King John to creep down upon us. Those who had the control of the transportation had by their wretched management lessened the number of animals by the 22nd of February by some 1,900. Many of them had died, and the usefulness of the others was destroyed. A part of this wholesale destruction came from not properly feeding and watering the animals on the road, disregarding of their wounds, and never removing the pack saddle. There were many supplies in the country, such as teff, durra, and barley flour, and an unlimited supply of cattle and sheep. To induce the inhabitants to bring them into camp, a market was established, and the people heartily responded. But their treatment by the Sudanese soldiers, who were really savages and not able to distinguish between friend and foe, destroyed the trade to a great extent.
The foreign prisoners he mentioned at the beginning were captured during an earlier expedition, led by a Danish man named Arendrup. Kirkham, on the other hand, had remained in Ethiopia ever since the British expedition there. That expedition was in response to Emperor Theodros capturing British people to demand that the British sell him guns. The emperor killed himself at the end of this expedition, and eventually Johannes IV took power after defeating his rivals. But Lorin will constantly call him King John here, so don't get confused. Johannes is King John. Anyway, they found themselves in the valley of Gura and set up camp there. This will be the location of the major battle of this war.
Another of the princes deposed by King John, Degach Weldo Mikhail, came into camp about this time with his 2 sons and 200 or 300 followers. He had a splendid head. His iron gray locks were encircled by a band of gold, and marked face, prominent Roman nose, and deep-set, scintillating eyes that had a wonderfully cunning and knowing expression. To add to his grandeur, this grave and dignified savage covered himself with a traditional red umbrella. Those who followed him, and some in advance, beat on drums and blew instruments which emitted a shrill, piercing sound. Over his person, the Abyssinian chief, or man of wealth, Ozikiari. In this graceful drapery, he looks as dignified as the ancient Roman. He is never without his sharp-pointed lance, or his shield of rhinoceros skin embossed with silver and brass. He wears a heavy curved sword, like a scythe, sharp on both sides, and often carries an old-fashioned shotgun and pistol. The hair, which is disposed to be straight, is dressed with butter. Nothing delights the Abyssinian more than to feel melted butter with which he so copiously anoints his head. There is sound reason for the custom. Exposed to the broiling sun, it prevents its skin from cracking and gives it a glossy appearance. The party was a curious medley of patched and party-colored humanity, of chiefs, warriors, servants, horses, and mules. Looking at them in the distance, one would take them for a war party of Comanches on a trail to steal cattle from the settlements. The chief seemed pleased with my acquaintance, for he gave me a handsomely caparisoned mule, expecting no doubt a much larger present in return, as is their custom. I was puzzled to make a suitable return, as they do not value money, salt being their medium for exchange, and now and then, the Maria Theresa silver dollar.
Johannes, as you can see, has many rivals within Ethiopia, and many would present themselves to aid the Egyptians, but they were largely ignored. One interesting point to note here is the use of the Maria Theresa dollar. This, as the name suggests, is an Austrian currency, and it first found its way to Ethiopia in the 18th century. Over time, it became a widely accepted currency in Ethiopia, so much so that it's believed over 20% of the coins minted in Austria found their way here. They continued to be used even after the Austrians stopped minting them, so even during World War II, the British minted some in India to hand out to the resistance fighters. As for Lauren, we'll leave this video with him describing how the locals lived, but there will be a part 2 to this describing the battles.
Dysentery during the cold and rainy season proves fatal to Europeans, and a malignant fever lurks on the river just after the season, at the time when vegetable malaria is rife. This is one reason why the people of the country during this season do not sleep on the banks of the rivers, but construct their villages high enough on the mountains to escape the malaria from below. They have another reason. In war, mountain elevations are their principal means of protection. From these mountain rise, they can better communicate with their neighbors. It is their custom in case of alarm for the whole people of a village to collect on top of the mountain and scream. It is not surprising that these people are visited by extraordinary maladies, when it's considered that they take no sanitary precautions but live in filth, without the slightest attempt at cleanliness in eating or in person. They never wash themselves, except on holidays, and great numbers are crowded into a single small hut, where they cook, eat, and sleep. They live half the year upon teff and dura, and the other half upon raw meat, hot and reeking from the animal. They are utterly debased in morals. They are drunken when they can get a strong drink. No wonder the tapeworm and filaria are so common.